was a lot of sorrow this week for the loss of my grandmother. A lot of tears shed, a lot of stories told, a lot of heavy hearts. And sorrow, by definition, is a feeling of deep distress caused by loss. And so the emotions that we were feeling as a family were accurate. That's what we should have felt. It wasn't out of place. But what's the difference between sorrow and lament? And again, here's the definition for lamenting. It's a passionate expression of grief or sorrow. So you're thinking to yourself, well, that sounds similar. It goes on. It's an expression of regret or disappointment or a complaint. As a verb, it means to mourn, to express one's deep grief about something, to express regret, disappointment over something considered unsatisfactory, unreasonable, or unfair. And like I said, at first you would look at those two definitions and think, well, those are very similar. And to an extent they are. The difference is what they produce. Sorrow brings tears. Sorrow brings just this sense of, oh no, there's a loss. Lament, biblical lament, is totally different because it produces fruit. It produces something that is life-bearing. And when you consider, again, why the Psalms were collected, these were songs that were written over a period of time that when the children of Israel taken into captivity out of their disobedience, and they found themselves in Babylon, they wanted hope. And so they collected these psalms, they put them together in the order that we have so that they could have hope in the midst of their exile. Well, they were in exile because of their failures. Sorrow says, man, I'm bummed that I got caught. Lament says, God, thank you for catching me. Now meet me here. We've all expressed sorrow at one time in our lives or another. But the question is, have we truly lamented? Sorrow, I found in my life personally, has oftentimes led to guilt, where lamenting has led to healing. And so today we're going to look at how our hope for healing is tied to our lamenting. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at Psalm chapter 3, and it has this heading of it. It says, a Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. And so what we see is that David wrote this psalm. He wrote this psalm at a time in his life where he was fleeing for his life because his son wanted to kill him. I would kind of say that's a bad day. Isaac, don't get any ideas. I know we got a plan for you to take over, but not that way. Right? You could read about this in 2 Samuel chapter 15. It describes this point of David's life when this is going on. For a clearer understanding, what we need to do is we need to look at a couple things. We need to look at who joined Absalom in this pursuit of his father, and who that person was to the situation and to the narrative. You see, there was this guy who joined Absalom. His name was Ahithophel. He was one of the men who sided with Absalom. Who is he? And why am I highlighting him? That should be the questions you're asking, because those are the questions I'm going to answer. He was one of the men who sided with Absalom. But yet, we know this about him. He was from Gilah, a town in Judah. He was known for his wisdom and counsel, and it was highly valued in David's court. So he was one of David's counselors who gave David insight and wisdom on how to deal with certain things. The Bible describes his advice as being like receiving the word of God. So he would have been a godly man. But Ahithophel deserted David to become the advisor of Absalom. So who was he? Ahithophel was Bathsheba's great-grandfather. Let that sink in for a moment. This man would have watched, would have been there, would have probably comforted his granddaughter when her husband was murdered by David. He would have held her. He would have known the story. He would have seen how David treated her. What you can really say is that the events that David has experienced here is when his past resurfaces. Ever had that happen? So what hope do we have, and how does lament change that? And so now chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, and what we're going to see is lamenting brings healing to your past with a confidence and a hope. Verse 1, David cries out, "Lord, how they have increased who trouble me. Many are they who rise up against me. Many are they who say to me, or of me, there is no help for him in God. Selah." Psalm chapter 3 is a very personal psalm, a personal lament from David when his past reared its ugly head, where he finds himself face to face of the results of his failures in the past. Even though he had been forgiven, it still pops its head up. Much like us, our sins are forgiven, but oftentimes it pops up like whack-a-mole. But David here, he laments, he's honest. And I think we need to understand that about lamentation. When we are lamenting, it's us being completely vulnerable, completely honest about our situations. And you know what? You don't have to hide because of your shame. Sorrow leaves you sometimes feeling guilty for what you did. But lamenting says, God, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to be open. I'm going to be honest. I'm going to be totally transparent. Here I am. What you see is what you get. And that's what David's doing here. And he begins with the name Lord, which is the word Jehovah, which means the existing one. Why would David start with that? David used that term to begin this song of lament because David knew that nothing was beyond the existing one to accomplish and handle. That this problem, this situation, this past rearing its ugly head, he knew that the only one that could handle that was God himself, was Jehovah, the self-existing one, the one who has shown himself faithful time and time and time again. You see, David knew that the lament for his past allowed him to be able to cry honestly to the God who was always there for help. He knew that as his past popped itself up, he wasn't going to be disciplined for it any longer. He just now had to see that God was faithful in the midst of it popping its head up. He says, Lord, how they have increased who trouble me. He says, there's people all around me. This problem's everywhere. Many are against me. They're saying there's no help for me. But yet, David cries for help here. You see, lamenting focuses not on what others are saying, but what one knows about the presence of God in their life. People are going to talk, especially if you do things in a small community. Everybody will know. Or if you have social media, everybody will know. So know this, when everyone else is saying there's no hope, lament gave David a confidence and a hope not to listen to what everybody else was saying. Just so you know, what everybody else is saying doesn't matter. Who cares? What matters is what God is saying. And as we lament, we begin to hear what he's saying. But you want to know something interesting? The word help in the Hebrew is Yeshua. So, verse 2 could be read this way. Many are saying there is no Yeshua for you. Let me word it a little differently. How could God love somebody like you? You've messed up so bad. There's no hope. It's translated save in verse 7, salvation in verse 8. It gives us, ready for this? In Matthew 1:21, the name of Jesus. And now we come to the first time the word Selah is mentioned in the Bible. And it's here as David says, listen to what I'm saying, Selah. The word simply means to stop and pause and consider. Remember how we stated last week that as we study the book of Psalms, it's not to be read quickly just so you can pick out your favorite one and say, oh, I got it. It's to be read slowly, to stop and pause for a moment. The word Selah is used 71 times in the Psalms. And then it's used 3 times in the book of Habakkuk. To pause and to reflect. And as we do that, you know what you see? You will see this, that lamenting produced in David a healing from his past and a hope in Jesus to help him in the future in his times of trouble and when his past comes back to rear its ugly head. And that's the same hope that we have. Verses 3 and 4 is going to show us that lamenting actually, not only does it offer us hope, but it actually protects us. Because David goes on, he says, but you, O Lord, are a shield for me, my glory and the one who lifts up my head. I cried to the Lord with my voice, and he heard me from his holy hill. Selah. Verses 3 and 4 contrast verse 1 and 2. Remember how we said in Hebrew poetry, it's usually a couple sentences that make a statement and then it's contrasted or magnified in another two, and that's what we see here. And David uses words like shield, glory, the lifter of one's head. Now, for us, we hear about a shield and we're like, oh, yeah, okay. We just kind of maybe think, if you're like me, you'd probably think of that guy at Round Table, the armor, really I'm thinking about the pizza, not the armor, but that's the best I could come up with. But my point is for us, a shield wouldn't have been as significant as it was for David. David literally would hold a shield when he would go to battle. Or he had an armor bearer that was out before him carrying these shields. So he understood, he knew about shields. Paul would later on tell us that what are we to do? Take up the shield of faith. To do what? Those fiery darts that the enemy is putting. When he pulls out those arrows of our past and starts shooting them at us, the shield of faith defends us from those. David understood not just the shield, but he understood the glory of God. You see, faith says, I find my value not in what I do or don't do, not in my victories or my failures, but my glory is in Yeshua or Jesus. Why? Because Jesus is the lifter of my head. David said, I cried to the Lord. And that means he called upon the Lord And he did it often. So when we're faced with our past failures, like David, let's call upon the Lord, who hears our cry from the holy hill. Now, we need to understand that that's looking into the future, because at this point in time, the temple wasn't built on that hill where the glory of the Lord would dwell. The glory was with the tabernacle that moved around. It was there at the, on the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant. But there would come a time where on that hill there would be a temple that would build where the glory of God would dwell, where the Shekinah glory, the weightiness of God would be, where everybody who was scattered would once a year come and celebrate the Passover and come, to where the presence of God was. They knew where God would be, but yet it had not been yet built yet. 2 Samuel 15 tells us the ark was around, and that's where the presence of God was. And what it shows me is this, that instead of focusing on the past or even the present, what we need to do is be like David and look to the future. Look to the coming return of our King. Because the temple is not there anymore. So we're in the same similar boat. The glory of God doesn't dwell in that place any longer. But what do we know? The Bible tells us that we are the temple of the Holy Spirit, that God dwells in us. And our King is coming. And there's going to be darts flying. But our hope is that as we grab that shield of faith, God protects our heart. David at this point may have been forced off his throne, but Jesus wasn't. Jesus is still seated on the throne, and he's still in control. David kept crying out, knowing that God had not forsaken and would not forsake him, regardless of what his current situation looked like. And everybody around them was saying, there's no help for David. But David knew that God was his shield, and in faith he picked it up, and his head was lifted up, and he trusted not in the temple, but the one that the temple pointed to, Jesus. And so as we pause, we see that the healing presence of Jesus is the fruit of lamenting. He goes on, I lay down and slept. I woke and the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you have struck all my enemies on the cheekbone. You have broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing is upon your people. Selah. And what's so amazing to me is that the healing that lamenting offers leads to a peace that passes all understanding. You see, David's life was literally threatened. People were wanting to kill him. To my knowledge, with the exception of maybe some of my children, nobody has really wanted to take my life. Like, nobody's hiring a hitman for me, like, that I know of. Like, you might be out there. Just don't tell me, because it would ruin my day. But David literally had people that wanted him dead. He was surrounded. There is no place in the world that David should have been able to lay down and sleep with the reality of what he was going through. But he was able to. Why? We're told that he knew that the Lord was the one who sustained him. He laid down, he slept. Why? Because he was trusting in the healing power of what Jesus could offer and the fruit that comes and that's produced from lamenting. His lamenting gave him peace that passed all understanding and enabled him to sleep in a situation that he shouldn't have been able to sleep in. He knew in verse 7-8 that God, what God had done, And it gave him a confidence, not just of what he had done, but what he would continue to do. You see, what God does for us isn't just a one-time deal. He doesn't just save us once and say, okay, now figure it out on your own. No, he sustains us, right? It's the Lord that sustained me. And when we pause and we step back and we take a deep breath and we reflect on this, what we see is that God works on our behalf even while we're sleeping. It doesn't stop. We see that the fruit of lamenting is that God not only gives us rest, but while we rest, he is rescuing and healing us. Then we get to Psalm chapter 4. And the title of it says, "The Safety of the Faithful, to the chief musician with stringed instruments, a psalm of David." And so Psalm chapter 3, they say, is a morning prayer. Not like morning as in crying, but morning as in early morning. Okay? So there's something to be said about getting up before the sun comes up. But they say that chapter 4 is an evening psalm, meaning he wrote this in the evening. But these two go together. And what I love about that, and what it shows us, is that David sought the Lord in the morning, and he came back and he thanked the Lord in the evening for whatever took place during the day. And so now we come to verses 1 and 2, and what we're going to see is that lamenting roots us in God's healing. Verse 1, "Hear me when I call, O God of my righteous. You have relieved me of my distress. Have mercy on me and hear my prayers. How long, O you sons of men, will you turn my glory to shame? How long will you love worthlessness and seek falsehood? Selah." And so we see David crying out here. He says, "Hear me when I cry, O God, my righteousness. You have relieved me of my distress." That word distress to me is very fascinating because what it means is this. It means to be pressed into a corner or a tight place. Ever been there? Like, I have nowhere to go. We might say, well, I was between a rock and a hard place. You know? Let's think back. What do we know? As God delivered the children of Israel from Egypt, what did they have? Water in front of them and the army behind him. And then God parted the waters. They went on dry ground, and the army got drowned in those waters. They understood. David understood being stuck between a rock and a hard place. David knew that he didn't deserve help, but yet his prayer was rooted in the healing that is offered by God's mercy and his grace. God, I don't deserve it, but I'm rooted in your mercy and your grace. You've saved me before, and you're going to save me again because you don't give up on me. You see, God's grace gives us what we don't deserve, and God in his mercy doesn't give us what we do deserve. We may not understand grace and mercy completely. And oftentimes I think what we do is we begin to question not his grace and his mercy, but his timing. I know for me, that's my biggest concern is like, God, you're not working on my timeline. It would be a lot easier if you just take my counsel, God, and do it like I want you to do it. Could you imagine if for a moment God did that for just like one time? I think you'd be thoroughly disappointed. But like David, we ask the same question, how long? And it's, lament says it's okay to ask that question. David didn't get reprimanded for saying, God, how long? When's it going to happen, God? They're all around me. Remember that? I'm kind of stuck in the corner here. I'm in a tight place. I need some help. Partly my fault. help. But you want to know what his question was rooted in? God's grace and his mercy. He's not asking God, how long until you deliver me? He's really asking God, how long until your grace and your mercy show up? Because even if God didn't deliver him, God could still be gracious and merciful in that situation. You may not get what you think you need or want or desire, but what you need and want is God's grace and his mercy in that situation, and you can be guaranteed this, that he will give you grace and mercy in that situation. Paul had a thorn in his flesh, don't know what it was. He prayed and he prayed that God would remove it time and time and time again, but eventually he said, but your grace is sufficient for me. Charles Spurgeon said, this is another instance of David's common habit of pleading past mercies as a ground for present favor. He looked back at the past and held on to what God can do in the future. And as we pause, we see how lamenting uses past mercies and grace in our life to heal and root us in the future hope of God showing up again. But verses 3 and 4, we're going to see how lamenting is really what sets the Christian apart from anybody else. It says, but know that the Lord has set apart for himself him who is godly. The Lord will hear when I call him. Be angry and do not sin. Some of you should be highlighting that right now, I'm just saying. Just pull it out and highlight it. Meditate within your hearts on your bed and be still. Selah. Guys, if you want to take a nap, David gave you a verse. Just make sure you're meditating. So change your bed to call it meditation and just tell everybody, hey, I'm going to meditate. It's perfect. But you know what? David knew something about the mercy and grace of God. David knew that the mercy and grace of God is what sets us apart, but not to continue to do what we want to do. It sets us apart to God. So why would he use the term set apart? This wasn't to boast. This wasn't so he could say, I'm on God's team. I'm on the best team, and you're not. I mean, that's not what it was. No, he uses this term not as one to boast in how good and worthy he is to be set apart, but rather to show how merciful and gracious God is. So if you're set apart, it's because you were pretty messed up. There was a term that used to flow around here back in the early 2000s. It was lug nut. Some of you that were here from the beginning would, I remember Sean calling me a lug nut. I resemble that remark. Like, that's as dense as I am. Like, I don't deserve anything. I'm like a lug nut. And I'm not even like the special lug nuts that need a special key to open them. No, I'm like your run-of-the-mill one. Like anything can pull that one off. My point is this. We need mercy and we need grace. We don't deserve mercy and deserve grace because of how great we are. You see, the result of being set apart is that we can be angry and not sin. We could look at situations differently. When somebody rubs us the wrong way, when things happen here, the context is David's son is coming to kill him. And he could, in that time, say, well, let's be angry and sin not. David had every reason to be upset, but he had no reason to sin. And we may have reasons to be upset, but we never have a reason to sin. So the question for me anyway is, how do we accomplish verse 4? And that's when David says, meditate within your heart on your bed and be still. Step back, slow down, lay down if you need to. Meditate on the faithfulness, the goodness, the grace, the mercy of God. And trust him. Slow down and be still, meditating on God's grace and mercy and his healing. That's what he's saying. And then go to bed. Meditate on God's faithfulness. Trust him with your circumstances that you can't change. And then go to bed. Because remember, while we're sleeping, God's still working. While we're sleeping, God's still restoring. And the last thing that we're going to see is that lamenting strengthens our faith. Verses 5 through 8. Offer the sacrifice of righteousness and put your trust in the Lord. There are many who say, who will show us any good? Lord, lift up the light of your countenance upon us. You have put gladness in my heart more than in the seasons that their grain and wine increased. I will both lie down in peace and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. So because we are set apart, what are we to do? We're to offer sacrifices of righteousness. Well, what is that? Well, this brings us back to Genesis 15:6, where the first time the word righteousness was mentioned in the Bible, and that's with Abraham. And we're told that Abraham believed God, and it was accredited to him as righteousness. That word accredited to bankers' terms. It means to be deposited in one's account. So Abraham believed God. Abraham is our father of faith. So Abraham's faith is what led him to be righteous. Because as Abraham put faith in God, God's righteousness was then put into Abraham's account. And so how do we make sacrifices of righteousness? We simply walk by faith. We trust God in all of our situations. It's interesting because David points out at this point what people are saying. They're saying there's, no good for us. Nothing good's going to happen. But at the end of the day, what did David's lamenting do? But brought him gladness, brought him joy. Jeremiah 31:13 tells us this. It says, then the virgins shall rejoice in the dance, and the young men and the old together. For I will turn their mourning to joy, will comfort them and make them rejoice rather than sorrow. Guys, we can have joy and we can rejoice regardless of our circumstances. That's the beauty of it. And then verse 8, I will both lie down in peace and sleep. The word peace is the word shalom, and it means more than just the absence of conflict, but it carries with it the idea of confidence and fullness of life, meaning that there's something present in the peace that God offers that is not anywhere else. And I want to suggest that true shalom is the result of the healing presence of Jesus in our lives. Because I know for me that until God brought healing of my past failures, of the things I tried to make sense with, I had no peace. But the moment he healed those, when those past things would pop up like the whack-a-mole, they didn't have the same impact. That fiery dart was a dud. It blew up way before it got even close. It had no power. David reminds us that we can sleep well because our safety is from the Lord, not from the changing of our circumstances or even the changing of how we feel. And it's verse 8 that links chapter 4 with chapter 3, showing us that lamenting strengthens our faith. a faith that sets us apart and roots us in Jesus, producing fruit that enables us to face our past with confidence, with hope, and with healing. Guys, that's the fruit of lamenting. And that's what Jesus is offering today. A healing that may not change your circumstance, but it'll focus your eyes to the future while looking back at what Jesus has done in the past to show you that he's with you in the present. So I just pray, my prayer this week has been, God, bring healing to your people. Bring hope and confidence to strengthen our faith, to keep us going as we follow Jesus with the sheer goal of making him famous, watching as he brings confidence and hope and healing to the people around us.